Hello and welcome to this PBR Painter project-based tutorial video. In this video, we're going to be starting with this very simple machete mesh, and we're going to be building up this really complex looking rusty machete material just using PBR Painter completely within Blender. Now I'm going to step through the whole process, starting with separating out the different parts of your model using ID maps, then using PBR materials to give your model a really nice base material. Then we're going to add these various different layers that are going to add all sorts of different complexity to the model. So there's going to be rust, there's going to be scratches, bolts that are going to be painted on using PBR Painter's multi-painter, fingerprints added to the handle, and finally a little PBR Painter logo that's going to be painted onto the bottom corner of the handle. Now I'm going to jump in a second, but before I do, I'm just going to say that this video is not going to cover the UV unwrapping process, so it makes the assumption that you understand how to do this, and if you don't, that's okay. I'm going to put a link in the description to a tutorial that shows how to do this within Blender. The other important point is that if you are brand new to PBR Painter, this should not be the first video that you watch. I strongly recommend you check out all of the fundamental tutorials to understand exactly how things are working, because I really don't have the time to explain everything in depth while I'm creating this material. Anyway, with that housekeeping out of the way, let's make a start. Alright, so when you go to start a project like this in PBR Painter, the first thing you have to think about is how you're going to differentiate between the different parts in your model, assuming that your model has more than one major part to it. So by parts, I mean something like, in this case, there is the blade and also the handle, and these are going to be fundamentally different materials. So in PBR Painter, there are three main ways you can do this. Number one, you can basically work with different objects. So you can have these actually separated out into different meshes and then just work on them independently. Number two, you can use the material slots to actually add different materials to different parts. And both of those methods are actually integrated into PBR Painter, and I've got a tutorial kind of explaining that, which you should check out if you're interested. But the third way, and the way that we're going to do it in this video, is we're going to use something called ID maps, and this is going to let us use one single material for the whole thing and just separate those bits out using a color masking system, which I'm going to show in a second. So once you've made that decision to go with the ID maps, now it's just a matter of setting up your material. And what I recommend is to actually start by creating folders to represent the different parts, because then you can add layers directly to those folders and you don't have to worry about the organization later on. So I'm going to add two folders. I'm going to call one the blade, and I'm going to call the other one the handle. And now that I've done this, I can just add the layers for those specific parts directly into these different folders. And the last thing I need to do in terms of a setup step is to actually now set up the ID map that's going to separate out these different parts. So looking at the handle first, I'm going to turn on ID map. So I'm actually creating an ID map for the folder. And again, if you haven't watched the ID map tutorial, I recommend that. But what it's basically going to let us do is it's going to basically map everything in this folder to the handle and everything in this folder to the blade. And I'm going to use a vertex color ID map, and I'm just going to show the map on the model. And as you can see, I've done this earlier because this is how I had that previous material, but I'm going to do it again just to show how you can do this from scratch. So I'm going to add a new vertex color, and now we just have this kind of black color everywhere. So we need to use different colors to differentiate the different parts. So it's perfectly fine to leave one color as being black, and the only thing then that you need to do to actually assign this folder to this black color is just to change this ID color in here. So for this one, I'm going to click like this, and that basically says that any layer that comes into this folder is only going to go onto the black areas. And so the only thing left to do now to set up this ID map is we actually have to add a different color to the blade. And you can do that by vertex painting like this, but this is not going to work too well. What's generally easier is to press tab and go into edit mode, and then select the faces that you're interested in and use this fill selected faces tool, which is just going to fill those faces with this color. So I'm going to do this by basically going to face mode by pressing 3, and I'm going to hold down Alt and click on this one. And this is basically a loop around here now. And I'm just going to go fill, and that's going to fill this kind of region over here. And now all I need to do is just basically I'm going to go to the top orthographic view, and now I'm just going to basically select my different regions. So I'm going to press Alt and Z, and that's going to basically let me see through to both sides. And now I'm just going to select all these different regions like this, holding down Shift, and then fill those faces. So now I've got one part of my mesh is assigned to the blade, which is now represented by this blue color in here. And then the other part is black, which is the handle. And then the final thing left to do now is that I need to go across to the blade, turn on an ID map. I need to make sure this is the correct vertex color attribute, and then select the color like this. So now in principle, every layer in each of these regions should be mapped to the correct part of the model. So before we make any actual PBR materials, let's just have a look at that and see if it's working as expected as a kind of initial sanity check. So I'm going to add a layer into this blade and just give it a color. And as expected, now it's just adding the color in the blade. So then if we add a layer to the handle and do the same thing, we should end up with something like this. So now we've got the two different parts. So now we know that this is all working correctly, and we're now correctly mapping these layers to the right parts of the model. Okay, so now we've done the setup, now we're ready to start. So it takes a little bit to set that up. Obviously, the more complex your model is, the longer it's going to take. But the benefit of separating out your different parts into different folders, which is something that's brand new in PBR Painter 3 compared to earlier versions, is that you can then only deal with this ID map once for each of these different regions, and then you don't have to worry about it again. So I'm just going to get rid of these layers now. And with that, now we can actually start the fun part, which is adding the material to the mesh and slowly building up our layered PBR material. And the way we're going to start is with the blade, and it doesn't matter which one you start with, but in this case, I'm going to start with the blade, and I'm going to add a first layer, and this is just going to be a metal base. So I'm just going to basically create a base, simple metal, using a downloaded set of PBR textures, and I'll put a link to all the downloads in the description so you know where to find them because they're all free. And then from that, I'm going to build the more complex details using procedural effects and other things like that. So to start with, I'm going to import all those textures using this multi-import tool. And this is the folder with the textures I'm going to use in this case. I'm not going to use displacement because I'm just working with Eevee for this one. And using this multiple import tool, when I click this, as you can see, it's now imported that metal and correctly mapped it to the blade because it's in this blade folder with the ID map. And at this point, I don't actually need to do anything else with this layer. I can come back to this later and I can do things like correct the color if I want to, or make it a bit less rough or a bit more shiny. But for now, I'm just going to leave it as it is. It is being mapped using UV mapping, so you could use box mapping, but it looks pretty good because the seams in this case are actually hidden in these regions down here. And once I add the rust and everything else later on, it's perfectly fine. Okay, so now that I've added that to the blade, what I'm going to do before I do anything else to the blade, I just want to add something to the handle so that it doesn't look like this dull default material. And this is going to make it easier to texture the blade because it will kind of be in the context of the final wood for the handle. Jumping across to the handle now, I'm going to create a new layer and I'm going to call this one wood base. And I'm going to do the exact same thing, but now I'm going to use a base wood material. And so again, using the multi-import, and for the sake of the video, I've just skipped ahead to where this material is. And I'm just going to import these three different ones. And now you can see that it's now applied that to the handle. Another way you could do this importing is you could have your library of PBR textures or materials in the asset browser, and PBR Painter lets you do that exact same kind of multi-import directly from the asset browser. But either way, it's going to get the same final result. So the last thing I'm going to do before I swap back to that blade is I'm just going to change the rotation of this one because I want the grain of the wood to go long ways. And I'm just going to do this in here and make this 90 like that. Now I'm wondering whether I might actually make that a bit duller as well because it's a little bit too shiny. And I could make it a bit darker, but I'm actually pretty happy, I think, with that color. I'm just going to open up the roughness and I'm just going to adjust the HSV. And I'm just going to increase this value a bit like that. Okay, so now we've added our two different PBR materials to the two different parts using the ID maps. Now it's just a matter of going through and adding more detail to these different parts. So at this point, this is kind of a really common place to get to in Blender because you can do this fairly easily just using nodes. But now what we're going to do is we're going to go through a series of steps to really bring it to that next level. And we're going to start with the blade in this case. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add an edge to this. So I'm going to give it a kind of shiny edge along this side just to make it look a bit sharp because at the moment that looks fairly dull. And the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to add a new layer and call this one an edge. Again, into the blade folder. And for this, I'm going to mask this one so that it's only applied to this edge here. Fortunately, we can do that with a bevel mask. So if I open up the masks and add a new one, I'm going to change this to geometric and then bevel. Click OK. Now I need to swap to cycles to be able to actually see this mask. As you can see, this really nicely captures that edge like that. So all I need to do now to have this in Eevee is to actually bake this, which I can do here. And I'm going to leave this at 4K and 32 samples just to make sure that bevel is really nicely rendered, and click OK. And this is now just going to bake quickly. And now we have the exact same mask baked in 4K. So that looks pretty good. So I'm going to delete the other one now because this will just get hidden in case you want to bake it again. And now that that's baked to an image, I can then go back to Eevee. And now I have access to that really nice edge for this edge layer. Okay, so what I'm going to do is now turn off that mask. And I'm going to set up my channels to isolate this edge. So I'm going to do a few different things. So for one, I'm going to turn on the color. And I'm going to use a little bit of a bright white kind of color to lighten this edge. And to do that, I'm going to keep this at basically a full value of 1. And I'm going to change the mix to lighten. And it's too bright at the moment, but I'm going to adjust that later. I'm just going to get the channels set up, then I can make it the correct intensity later on. So I'm also going to turn on the metal, and what I'm going to try and do is give this a constant value of 1. And again, I can adjust the opacity later on. But this is just basically to make it look like that edge has been sharpened back to just having metal. In that same way, I'm going to turn on roughness and give it a fairly low roughness, just to make it shinier where that edge is. And the last thing I'll do is I'll turn on the normals and just give it a constant normal. So this is going to make it a bit flatter than those other parts of the blade. So right now, this looks like this. And it's kind of the right idea, but clearly way too intense. What I'm going to do is now go through these channels and just drop these opacities down a lot. Just so it's a very kind of subtle effect on the edges there. And you can really see when we change those normals, it's basically just flattening out that edge. And what I'm also going to do is I'm going to just, with this mask, I'm going to just change this color ramp a little bit and just bring it back a little bit like that. But then also bring this edge up a little bit, just to make it a little bit sharper where that blade edge kind of finishes there. And something that the bevel has done is that it's actually highlighted this part, which I don't really want. So I'm just going to go paint and I'm going to make that black, turning off the mask. And this Z mirror is currently enabled, which is actually good because what I want to do is just apply this to both this and the other side. So I'm going to just erase this. That. And so that should now have actually done it on the back, which it has, which is good. And I'm going to leave this in as a kind of really dull kind of edge wear on that top side. So I'm going to add a mask to the brush and just create a new texture. So now I'm going to actually do the painting with a mask on this brush. And I'm going to make this one clouds. And just get something like that so I can kind of see that's what it's going to look like. And then I'm just going to kind of just slowly go across and just basically remove a bunch of this. Now this effect is going to be really subtle because you're not going to see much, but it's just going to be enough to just add that touch of edge wear at the top. And on the top, I'll kind of just go through the middle here. put the strength down a bit and just basically rub out this top area just to kind of make it look a bit more random. And I'm actually going to turn off the Z now so it doesn't look symmetric, and just do some kind of different things on each part. So that's fine. So you may not even see that later on, but I've left it there just in case we want to kind of emphasize that edge. Okay, so now that I'm kind of happy with that, what I can do is close up this painting. I'm going to stop previewing the mask, and this is the kind of result that I'm getting. So that looks fairly nice. I might actually drop the color a little bit. I think it's a bit too intense still, because you want it to be fairly subtle. But other than that, I think I'm pretty happy right now. I might come back to that later once I've added some other details onto the blade. Okay, so the next detail that I want to add onto the blade is this procedural rust. And this is going to go a long way to making this look more realistic. There's different ways that you could do this. So you could have PBR textures. So you could do the similar sort of thing to what I did with this base metal. But in a different video, which I definitely suggest you check out, I showed how to create this kind of procedural rust effect. So this is rust that is just generated using procedural effects purely within PBR Painter. And that is this material in here. So I saved it in my asset browser. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you how you can just take that existing material and import it into this current material. So I'm going to right click this now and go PBR Painter import. And I'm going to select to import folders because I have my layers for that rust in a folder. And I click OK. So now we've got rust. It's kind of sitting outside this blade layer. But what we can do is we can just grab these layers and move them into this blade layer. So at the moment with PBR Painter 3, you can't yet have nested folders. So you can just have this kind of one layer of folders. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab these individual materials and I'm going to move them into this blade. And now this one. And now they're kind of correctly being mapped to the blade. And now I can just get rid of this rust folder. Okay, so in the other video where I created this rust material, I kind of made it with cycles in mind. So because I'm using Eevee, I'm going to make a few changes. So I'm going to turn off the height. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the normal channel and I'm going to drop the intensity a lot because it looks way too intense now in Eevee. Doesn't really look realistic. So I'm just going to drop that intensity by reducing the distance of the bump, but also reducing the strength to something like 0.1. And so now if we kind of zoom in like this, you can see that there's this really sort of subtle bumping happening. Now I'm going to take a look at the colors because this is all procedural, so I can actually change those colors, which is really handy. But before I do that, the other thing I need to do is address the fact that this rust mask is actually using an ambient occlusion node. So if I have a look at the mask, in Eevee it looks like this, but if I go to cycles, what you can see is it's actually generating rust in this crevice down here. So that's kind of a nice effect, and I really want that effect, but doing this as a mask in Eevee with ambient occlusion, even if you turn on ambient occlusion for Eevee, doesn't look particularly good. It also adds to the computation complexity of the material. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to demonstrate how to go to baking and bake a ambient occlusion mesh map. Again, this is explained in a separate video, but basically this is going to let me bake out the ambient occlusion once so that I can reuse it as many times as I want within any mask. So this is an alternative to just baking this mask. And what it's going to let me do is it's going to let me have full access to these different settings without having to worry about generating that ambient occlusion. All I need to do is I need to preview this ambient occlusion in here. And now I just need to bake that. And so I'm going to leave that at 2K resolution, which should be perfectly fine for something like this. And I'm going to leave all these settings the same. So I've got 32 bake samples again, and then 64 AO samples, clicking OK. Now that's just going to bake down. And now what we've got is, I'm still previewing this mesh map in here, we've now got this baked ambient occlusion. And what's really great with PBR Painter is that this is now automatically informing this so that I don't actually have to do anything else because I've already got this box ticked which says use baked mesh maps where possible. So when I baked that, it automatically updated this. And so now if I go back to Eevee, what you can see is we now have this ambient occlusion baked in. So I can adjust this crevice fill, and it's actually now using that mesh map directly. Whereas if I turn this off, I now lose that effect. So this integration is really useful because you can really take advantage of this pre-baking. Okay, so now that that's all set up, I'm going to have another look at that material. And now it's just a matter of basically adjusting these different settings in here to get the amount of coverage of the rust and also the intensity. And what this is basically doing is these two layers are kind of working together to give the overall procedural effect. And so I've now got full control over these different colors. And I'm not going to explain exactly how this works because that's part of the other video. All right, so that's looking nice. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a couple of additional masks into here that's going to add some more detail and some more interesting kind of distributions of this rust. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a layer mask. So this is basically taking whichever layer I pick, it's going to take the masks from that layer and it's going to use it as a mask in this layer. And I'm actually going to select the edge. And the reason for that is I'm going to subtract the edge from this mask because I want it to look like the rust is kind of less obvious on that edge, to look like it's kind of been sharpened and repeatedly removed from the edge. So I'm going to change the blend to subtract. And now what you can see is if I put that full, it just basically removes that from the edge. But I don't want that. I want to add a little bit of rust on the edge. So I'm just going to do something like that. So you get a bit of that edge coming through, but you still got a little bit of that rust kind of bleeding through as well. All right, so that's starting to look pretty good. I'm going to do one more thing in terms of these masks, and I'm going to add a mask that's basically going to make that rust appear according to the underlying metal texture. And to do this, I'm going to add a new mask again, and it's going to be an image texture. And the image I'm going to use is the displacement map that goes along with this underlying material, because it's going to mask the rust according to the different kind of topography or the height information. So if I import this, and again, I've skipped to this folder for the sake of the video, I'm going to grab this displacement map. And so this is going to let me basically mask according to that underlying metal. And so I'm going to look again at the mask stack. And to do that properly, I'm going to change the blend to multiply. And I'm going to set this blend factor to 1. So it's just completely multiplying this image. And now what I need to do is actually just drag this color ramp in. And as you can see, it's now starting to pull away that mask where this image is kind of dark. At this point, it's just basically a matter of getting the correct balance between these different masks. So I'm going to go back now and actually turn off this stack. And so now what you can see is when I play around with this color ramp, it's actually pulling that rust back. This gives me a few different levers that I can now pull to really fine tune this effect. So I can change how much I reduce the edge, like that. I can change the coverage of my rust, like that. And then I can change how much this image texture is being multiplied by basically just adjusting this color ramp. So I'm not going to play around with it too much because you could obviously spend a lot of time just kind of mucking around with this. I'm just going to do something that looks reasonably good, like that, and I might just pull the edge back a bit. And I just sped up the video then just while I tinkered with it, but all I was basically doing was just changing the kind of ordering and the blending of these two masks. And I'm pretty happy with how it is, so I'm just going to stop now and leave it like that. And as you can see, we've now got this nice combination of the rust coming through and the edge of the blade kind of showing through that rust. And now that it's kind of at this point, I might see if I can adjust the normals a bit more and make it a bit more intense, because I think that might look nice. So I think that actually looks quite good, doing something like that, maybe not that much. And I think that looks really nice. Maybe just with a little bit less of that edge subtraction like that. So we can kind of still see that blade on the edge, but it doesn't look as obviously sharpened back across the rust. And I'm going to leave it there in terms of working with these masks. I might actually just adjust the color slightly, maybe just to make it a little bit less bright. I think these colors are a bit too much for the kind of style that this is going for. So I might actually just bring these colors up a bit so we get more of this dark color in. Again, what's great about having all this procedural stuff is that you can modify this as much as you want at any point while you're building up this material. All right, so I think that's about it for the blade. I will add some scratches later on, but I'm going to wait and do that after I make some changes to the handle, because I'm going to add scratches onto the handle and also the blade. So I'm going to click out of this folder and just close up this one so that I'm hiding that from the UI. And you can kind of see everything that we've done if we just drag this opacity down. And now I'm going to jump across to the handle and I'm going to start working in this folder instead. And the first thing I'm going to do on the handle is I'm just going to add some kind of general bumps and wear. So I'm going to add a new layer and call this one wood bumps. And you'll see that the folder is automatically changed to handle because PBR Painter has recognized that we're now in this folder. So that's really handy. So you don't even have to worry about changing that. You'll automatically be put into the correct folder. Okay, so for this one, what I'm going to do is just create some kind of bumps onto the edges and around the middle of this handle. And I'm going to do that by turning on the normal channel and turning on layer bump. And basically what I'm going to do is create a mask, and then I'm going to use this layer bumping to bump into the wood. So I'm going to go invert layer bump because I'm going to be painting on a mask. And essentially what that means is that anywhere I paint white on my mask, it's just going to bump into that handle. So I'm going to add an image texture mask. And now clicking create new. And I'm just going to call this one wood bumps mask. And I'm going to leave it as black. And 2K resolution should be fine for this. And I don't need the alpha. So clicking OK. Now all I need to do is basically click paint, and essentially anywhere I paint white is going to bump into the wood. So we can test that out like that. So now it's created this little dot, which is obviously not what I want to do. So I'm going to undo that. And I'm going to do what I did earlier, and I'm going to create a mask again. So I've already got this one set up, so I'm going to use that because I just want to add some kind of random noise to my painting. But I will change the size because I want the bumps to be much smoother than those kind of fine bumps. So that's what my mask looks like. So now if I just drop the strength a little bit, so I'm going to go Shift and F to change that strength, put it down fairly low. If I just start painting on those edges, you should see like that, you can kind of now start to dent those edges in a bit. And I might make this a bit bigger still. And what I usually do to paint these kinds of bumps is to go more intense than I actually want. And then we can just adjust the intensity later using these tools in here. So we could just drop the strength, for example. So this is going to kind of let me make sure that I'm actually on the right areas and just that I'm kind of covering everything. And then we can just go back and change that later on. So I'm going to speed up the video and just go around the edges and do this a bit. So I'm just looking at the mask view now, and I've just been basically painting around those edges to give it this kind of random wear. And now that I've done that, it is obviously way too intense. So I'm going to go across to the normals, and I'm just going to drop this distance for a start. And that's probably enough, but I can also adjust the strength if I want to. So I think just changing that distance was enough to actually make that look a bit nicer and a bit more realistic. And it's just a kind of very subtle amount of bumping and wear along the edges. So I actually think that's probably enough. We could paint some more in the middle here. And then we could probably drop it back some more if we wanted. So we can have a look at how that actually looks. It's a fairly subtle effect, but it's just enough to kind of look like it's a little bit worn out, especially around those edges. And that looks pretty good, so I'm just going to leave it there. And the other thing I might do with this is add a little bit of a dark kind of color within those bumps to kind of show either a bit of dirt or just to kind of exaggerate those areas. So I'm going to turn on my color. I'm going to make this one a dark kind of color like that. And I'm just going to change this one to darken. And then it's just a matter of changing this opacity to see how much that's affecting it. So I think something like that looks pretty good. So you can see the effect without it, and that's where you add that into those regions. And just to kind of give it a little bit more variation like that. All right, so moving on from the bumps, now what I want to do is I want to add some kind of imperfections onto this handle. And I'm going to do this using fingerprints. And this is going to be the first time in this video that I'm going to showcase the multi-painting feature of PBR Painter. So this is something that's new in version 3, and it's going to basically let me paint, as I'll show, all of my different PBR channels together onto the handle. So I'm going to add a new layer. And again, this is something that's explained in detail in a different video, so check that out if you haven't. But we basically just need to add a multi-paint layer, and I'm going to call this one fingerprints. And then clicking OK. Now all we need to do is set this up with the correct image textures to project these fingerprints onto this handle. And again, we can do that with the multi-import tool. In this case, when we're working with a multi-paint layer, we actually have to define what our resolution is going to be, because this is the resolution that we're projecting onto. So I'm going to use 4K in this case to give it a nice high resolution finish, and then click OK. And I've navigated to this folder, which has got this fingerprints textures. So I've got a color, a normal, opacity, which is basically the mask, and roughness. So these are all going to work together to create a really nice fingerprint effect. So again, with the multi-import, I can import all of these, click import. But unlike a standard PBR Painter layer, that doesn't just add the images in. What it does is it actually loads up these textures onto your brush. So in this case, this is basically set up a texture onto the brush, and this is the opacity texture. So this is basically what's going to be masking these fingerprints. And so now if I just move this around a little bit, and you can rotate it by holding Control and then right clicking, I now can just project these different fingerprints anywhere onto my handle. And I'm going to leave this mask on because that's going to make it a bit more randomized. And I'm going to put the strength up, and I'm just going to basically get the scale right, and the rotation doesn't really matter. Scale you can change by holding Shift and right click. And then I'm just going to demonstrate what's going to happen. To do this multi-painting in a multi-paint layer, you hold Control Shift, and then you just do your painting as per normal. And so if I click, what happens for a start is, because this is using opacity or a mask, it's going to swap to mask view, and it lets me paint on the mask first. And then when I let go, what it's actually going to do is it's just going to basically go through all those different channels, and it fills them all in retrospectively. So now what we have is a normal image. So it's been painting onto this normal image, a roughness image, and also a color image. Like that. So this is the PBR Painter multi-painting really letting you do this. And this is something you really can't do elsewhere in Blender, at least at the time of making this video. And so now all I need to do is basically go over my knife handle and just add these different effects. So I'm going to speed up the video and do this. And so this is how that looks after I've added those fingerprints. I'm just going to turn off the mask and the texture for a second. And obviously this is way too intense, but now again, what we can do now that it's kind of projected these imperfections like this, we can play around with either the color ramp of the mask, like this, or just change basically the overall opacity of this layer. So I'm going to do that. So I'm just going to bring this down. And this basically then lets us have those fingerprints or those imperfections, and we can just tune how intense they are, or customize them by just playing around with these different things. And obviously we could add additional masks in here if we wanted to maybe add a noise mask or something to distribute those in a different way. But I'm just going to leave it like that for now. And I think that's probably a fairly good intensity. So it just gives enough to kind of show the fingerprints like that, but it's not too over the top. Something else I need to do, and something I actually forgot to do in this layer here, is I need to change the normals, and I need to click Combine Normals. Because what that does is it basically combines the normals from this layer with the normals underneath. Same thing goes for this bumps layer. So right now, if we have a look at the normal channel like this, the bumps are kind of dulling the normals of the wood. But if we combine the normals, you can see that those wood normals are actually coming through better. So this is the kind of difference. And this is obviously really important because you need those bumps to not kind of mask the underlying normals. You want them just to apply the bumps on top of those normals. So now you can see the bumps kind of add those bumps in, but they don't interfere with the wood underneath. Okay, so we're getting towards the end now, and the next thing I want to do is I want to add scratches. I want the scratches to be applied to the handle in a certain way, but then also applied onto the blade. But the effect of scratching wood is going to be very different than the effect of scratching metal. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a separate layer in each of these different groups, and I'm going to make them behave differently, but I'm going to join them with a common mask. So that way I can just paint on some scratches and I can just paint across the two different regions and they will behave differently. So let's set this up. So what I'm going to do is now create a new layer on top of this one. And this one I'm going to call scratches, or wood scratches. And in this case, it's just going to, again, be a standard layer. And while I'm here, I'm going to add another layer in here. And I'm going to call it metal scratches. And as I said, these two layers are going to act very differently, but they're going to share a common mask. So I'm going to add a image texture mask again to this layer and create a new image. In this case, I'm going to call this one scratches mask. And I'm going to keep this one at 4K resolution to really show those scratches nicely. And then I'm going to click OK. And now all I'm going to do is I'm going to go up to my wood layer and I'm just going to import that mask from the other layer. So I can go to my active material here, go across to metal scratches and just import that mask. And basically all that did was create an image texture mask and just had the same image. So you could do that manually as well. So now what's going to happen is anytime I paint onto this image, I can paint across these two regions and these two layers will do different things. All right, so now I need to set up the layers. So in both cases, they're going to have normals because I want the scratches obviously to indent into the material. So again, I'm going to do the same thing where I set up the layer bump and invert the bump. So I'm going to do the same thing on this one as well. And what I'm going to do later is I'm going to change these strengths and distances to make it look realistic, but I don't have to worry about that now because I can just do that after I've done some painting. I'm also going to change some other channels, but again, I'm going to leave that until I've actually put some scratches on so I can kind of show what I'm doing with those. So now what I want to do is I want to actually paint on my scratches onto this mask. So what I need now is an image of scratches that I can then use to projection paint those scratches onto the material. And there's plenty of these available online for free, so you can often find these kinds of masks that you can then just load in. But for the sake of demonstrating something new, I'm going to actually create a mask myself using PBR Painter. And to do this, what I'm going to do is create a new plane. And I'm going to create a new material and a new layer and just call it layer, doesn't matter. And inside this layer, I'm going to add a mask, and this is going to be this scratches mask. So if I preview this, all I have now is this plane that has a bunch of random scratches across it. So I'm going to increase the thickness of the scratches and maybe the length. And I'm actually going to change this mapping to make them a bit larger. So you can drop the scale to make some kind of larger scratches like this. And what I'm trying to do is just generate a nice simple image of some scratches that I can then use to paint over my model. So something like that looks pretty good. Now all I need to do is just bake this to an image, because then I have the image and then I can then reuse that back in this material to do that painting. So clicking bake, keeping this at 4K. I don't need 32 bake samples because that's more if you're using something like ambient occlusion or bevel. Using one is perfectly fine for a still image like this. So now that's just doing that baking. And the result is we now have an image that looks like this. And I might change that to just call it baked scratches so that I can find it later. And at that point, I don't need this plane anymore, so I can get rid of it. By the way, this is on the roadmap to kind of make this a bit more automated so you can quickly bake out your own images to use as projection masks. But for right now, in this current version, this is how you do it. So now that I'm in here and I'm back to my scratches, I'm going to click paint. And I'm going to change this to that image that I just had. So I'm going to go back to another texture in here. And I'm going to make this one image. Actually, before I do that, I just realized it's actually better to not use this as a brush texture. This is meant to be a mask, because otherwise, if you're using a texture, what's actually happening is, because there's black in that mask, it's going to replace the areas of white with black every time you do a new paint. Whereas if you're doing a mask, it will actually use this black region to actually mask the brush rather than paint on black over your mask. So what we can now do is we can see with the brush mask like this, if I just click like that, it's now just adding those scratches on directly. So this is kind of a better approach than putting it as a texture, because if you add it just as a texture, all it's going to do is just basically erase that, because most of your random image is black, and so it's just going to replace the white with black. So we don't want that. We want to add it as a mask. And now that we've got that, we can just kind of randomly click, and it's just going to randomly add scratches like this. So that's really cool. So now you can kind of build up more quickly these scratches all over your model. And before I do that, and before I go and just paint everywhere, I'm now going to turn off the mask, and I'm actually going to look at how these scratches are looking. So you can really see them through the wood, but they're looking a bit too intense. And also I want to actually set up some other channels to add some other effects. So with the wood one specifically, this is one of those main scratches that I've done. What I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on a color, and I'm going to give it this kind of light color like this. And I'm going to just basically go to lighten. And the reason is, with wood, if you kind of scratch into wood, you often get this kind of lightish effect coming through. Very subtle. But if we do that, now we can see the scratches have kind of revealed a lighter inside to the wood. So if we see that with and without that color, you can see that that adds a kind of nice touch. In a similar way, I'm going to go to my metal, and I'm going to go to the metal scratches, and I'm going to add a color again, and I'm going to add this light color because I want these scratches to basically be revealing a light metal. And I'm also going to add metallic of one, and I'm going to make them a bit shiny. And this is kind of very similar to that edge effect that I was making earlier. So that's kind of the right effect, but it's way too intense. So I'm just going to reduce the opacities of these channels a little bit. So I want this to all be very subtle. I'll make the metallic a bit more obvious. And finally, I'm going to reduce the normal strength, or actually start with the distance and then reduce the strength as well. And the main reason for that is because the scratches in the wood are obviously going to be a lot deeper than the scratches in the metal, because the metal is a lot harder. So I think I'll start with something like that. And I'm just going to reduce this color a little bit. And as I'm doing this, something I thought might actually look nice is if I actually subtract from the rust wherever the scratches are. So I might actually go back into this rust layer. I might add a new mask, again an image texture. Actually, I can just import that. And from, again, the active material. And I'm just going to grab that mask. And again, I'm going to go subtract. And let's see how this looks. So that's kind of cool because now it's actually removing the rust where there's the scratch. So I might not make it that intense, but I can do something like that. So now it actually looks like it's actually cutting through that rust. Okay, so now that all that's set up, I've got my scratches set up for my wood, I've got my scratches set up for my blade. Now I'm finally going to go back and actually do that painting properly. And in this case, all I'm going to do is I'm going to actually just start painting along the edges. So as you can see, it's now adding these tiny little scratches to the edges, and you can make them larger like this. But the main thing I want to do, actually I might view the mask, is I'm going to add heaps of little scratches just along the edge to really make that look like it's nice and worn. And I'm just going to go over the edge like this and just do this a bunch of times. And I'm kind of keeping the brush off the edge so that only really those scratches in that direction kind of come onto the blade. And I'm just going to do this a bunch of times around the edge and just build up that effect like that. And I'm going to speed up the video and then come in at the end once I've done more of that painting. Alright, so now I've done that. I think that's a lot. I'm going to turn this off. Now let's have a look. So close up, we can kind of see there's a lot of little marks on there, which I think actually looks quite good. I don't think it's over the top. I think it nicely shows a huge amount of scratches down the bottom here. I think it's a bit too intense where the rust is, so I might go back to that rust layer and just drop this back a bit. I think it was subtracting too much. I think that looks quite good. And I think overall I'm pretty happy with how that looks. So now I'm going to move across to the wood and just do the same kind of thing over here. So again, I'm just going to look at the mask, put the strength down a bit, and just add some scratches just generally over the top. But let's have a look and see how that looks. So looking closely, you can see those little scratches are kind of coming through very subtly, which I think looks quite good. And I think the intensity is about right. I might see what it looks like if I just play around with this strength. I think dropping the strength a little bit looks nice, and then maybe dropping this back a little bit too. Alright, so we're nearly at the end of the video now, or at least at the end of the material creation. One of the main other things that we need to do is actually add the bolt onto the handle here. And I'm going to do it using, again, that multi-painting. So I'm going to go add layer, call this one bolt, and I'm going to create a multi-paint layer once again. So then what I need to do is actually load in my images, and I'm going to use the same metal that I used here. And again, go into 4K. I'm not actually importing copies because it will check for the existing images in Blender, but this is just as an easy way to import these images as a layer. And so now what it's done is it's just brought that metal in, and now I can just projection paint these bolts on. So what I'm going to do is change this to the top orthographic view, so I'm straight looking down from the top. Now, if I put my strength up, I can just paint this metal into these different regions here. I'm going to go a bit closer actually, and I basically just want to align this and choose my spots that I can then add on as bolts. Before I do any more painting, something I need to do is change the fall off of the brush. So the fall off is basically how the intensity changes from the center of the brush to the edges. and you can change that in this panel in here. By default, this is set to smooth, which is that kind of general smooth brush effect. I'm going to make my own custom one, which I've actually prepared earlier. And basically all I did with this was to drag this point across here. What that's going to do is it's going to create a nice hard edge on my brush, which is important for adding that kind of bolt effect. So now changing the size down to something reasonable like that, I think. I'm just going to start by adding one bolt right here. So again, with multi-paint, it's Control-Shift-Click. And so now what it's done is it's just added that metal in that spot there. So now I'm going to add another one in the middle. Just going to move this to something nice like that. And then finally doing one over this side like that. Actually, something I forgot to do, I meant to turn on projection paint because, sorry, symmetry in the Z, because I want to paint these on both sides. So I'm just going to go over and do these again to make sure they come through on both sides. So now I should have the metal is now painted on both sides of that handle. And I'm actually wondering if the bolts look a little bit too big, but we'll see. What I'll do now is I'll just set up the normals to make them actually bump into the handle. And to do that, I just need to again turn on layer bump. And then once again, I need to invert. So now they're kind of dented into the handle. I think they're a bit too big, so I'm going to actually redo that. So all I need to do is just go erase alpha and do the same multi-painting. And now I can do the same thing again, and I'll just speed it up for the video. All right, so I think that looks better. And I'm just going to click off this layer to get rid of that texture paint mode. And I think I'm happy with that size and placement of the bolts. So again, you can see that that should have added to both sides, which it has. So now we've basically just projection painted on these 3D looking kind of bolts, or whatever you would call these metal parts that are attaching to the wood. And the great thing is we can do that just with the material. So the actual mesh is very low poly like this, but now we've got these really simple but nice looking metal circles in here. All right, so with the bolts added, now we're pretty much done. So let's have a look at how the whole thing is looking. So I'm pretty happy with how that's turned out. Now I'm just going to add one more thing onto the handle, which is just going to be this little decal stamp thing. It's just going to say PBR Painter. One more little thing that you can do quite easily with the add-on. So again, I'm going to go projection paint, and I'm going to go into the handle. And in this case, I'm going to add a standard layer, and I'm going to call this one logo. And I'm going to make this one painted and 4K, clicking OK. And I'm going to get rid of this. Actually, I'll keep the brush texture, but this time I'm going to change this one to the PBR Painter logo. So I'm just going to import that one. And that's what that looks like. So it's almost right, except the aspect ratio is now wrong. And the easiest way to correct that is to go under texture mapping and click image aspect. And now it's actually the correct aspect ratio for that logo. Actually, I meant to do this as a mask once again, so I'm going to turn that one off because I need to be masking, not painting a texture. And I'm just going to put this one to that same texture. And again, do this as a stencil. And now I just need to do that mapping again. With a stencil, you need to hold Shift and then Alt and then right click to move or to resize. And then Control Alt to rotate like that. And then Alt right click to move it like that. So it's all the same key bindings as for the mask, or sorry, for the stencil, but with the addition of Alt. So I'm just going to chuck this onto this part here somewhere. I might actually shrink that in a little bit because it's a bit wide. And I'm just going to put that down somewhere like that. I'm going to make the color just a constant color and just make it like a dark, or maybe even just a black. And now just painting that on. And now we've just added that little logo into the corner there. And one thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of dent that in. So I'm going to turn on normals and bump it in again. And again, just hit combine normals. Something cool you can do with this combine normals is that you can actually adjust the underlying normal strength. So I might drop that off, even though this is very small, you can't really see it, but just to kind of show what it does, it basically just drops those underlying normals. And I'll just turn on the roughness to do something like that. All right, so that's it. So that's my little logo that I put in the corner, which looks kind of nice. All right, so that's the end. So we've gone from a very simple kind of low poly looking mesh like this. And to be specific, that is just $389 faces in that one. And we got this kind of really nice looking complex material which we've built using these various layers of details. So once you get to this point, one thing you'll often want to do, especially if you want to use this in some external software, which is typically the case, you'll want to be able to basically bake this down into a set of textures that you can then use to export this model. And you can do that in PBR Painter using the baking tab. So I'm going to go across to that now. I'm not going to go into a lot of details about all of these different settings because there are videos to explain that. I'm just going to go through the main ones. And that is basically under these general settings, when you're wanting to export your material, you have to choose whether or not you want to save the textures externally. So usually that's a yes, because you want to actually save these as image files. You don't want them packed into Blender. And I've got the add-on preferences. If I go into preferences in here, I've got this set up to basically always save my images externally, and they save to a subdirectory. So again, this is explained in other videos, but basically this lets you automatically save all the images you generate in PBR Painter into this subdirectory. So you can just use that same preference for exporting your textures, or you can turn that off and you can specify a very specific directory where you want to export these materials or this material. So I'm just going to leave that as the add-on preferences, and that's just going to save it in that subdirectory. So the final thing you need to do is you need to go into the material exporting tab. You can then choose a resolution, a margin for the baking, which is how much it kind of extends out of the edge of the UVs, and then bake samples, which basically you can leave as 1 unless your material is generating things like ambient occlusion or bevel, where you want to actually increase those samples to make sure they're not noisy. But in this case, I've already pre-baked everything I need, so I can leave that as 1. And I'm just going to click this create exportable material because, as I'll show, this is going to create another material separate to this one with all those baked images automatically loaded into the node tree. With all of that set up, and without going into more detail, I'm going to leave the channel selection as automatic, and that will just pick which channels need to be baked based on what channels I've used in my layers. And then from that, I can just go bake. And what that's going to do is it's going to cycle through those different channels and bake them all to individual images. So now it's starting with the base color. And we can kind of see that baking down here. Now it's baking the metallic. Now it's baking the roughness. And then baking the normals as well. So now that that's baked, because I selected to create a exportable material, it's created this new material, which is just the same material name with this added bit at the end. And what I can actually do is I can actually jump across to that one. And basically this is now that same material, except it's no longer using PBR Painter layers. If we jump to the shading tab, it has basically taken all of that information, it's added them into these individual image textures, and this exportable material is just in a standard Blender format ready to be exported. So this is really useful because then you can go straight from your highly complex PBR Painter material directly into these image textures, and then you can just use normal export workflows that you would otherwise use in Blender. So there we have it, a nicely baked and ready to use machete, created just using Blender and just using PBR Painter. Alright, I'm going to leave the video there. Thanks for watching, and of course if you haven't subscribed, please do subscribe because more videos will be released to cover all the awesome things that you can do in PBR Painter. Anyway, that's it for me, so as always, thanks for watching and I'll catch you in another video. Cheers!